Welcome to the Battles We Pick podcast, where advocates and organizers talk about their work pushing for social, political, and policy change. Today we have a special edition to mark the podcast's 10-episode milestone. My guest is Kathleen Sullivan, principal of Fine Grade Strategies, which helps nonprofits plan their advocacy and policy change work and assess its impact. Kathleen is an attorney and, prior to launching her consulting practice, was a policy change advocate specializing mostly in human rights and immigrant rights, working for such groups as Physicians for Human Rights, Catholic Legal Immigration Network, U.S. Committee for Refugees, as well as a stint as Senator Ted Kennedy's staff counsel for the Subcommittee on Immigration and Refugee Affairs. Closer to home for me, Kathleen has been an indispensable thought partner, writing partner, and sometimes business partner as I followed her lead in joining the field of evaluating advocacy work. In bringing Kathleen onto the podcast, I wanted to draw on that evaluator and nonprofit consultant perspective by listening back to earlier podcast guests and some of their most interesting points. The result was a terrific discussion of the changing role of policy change advocates, and especially the increased emphasis on having the social change agenda set by communities most affected, prioritizing the issues and changes they view as most important. Now this is going to be fun, really fun. Kathleen Sullivan is a fellow evaluator of advocacy and organizing efforts, shares a similar background to mine as an advocacy practitioner, has been a close collaborator and frequent writing partner, and is a good friend, which is why I wanted to do something special and different with Kathleen. Something actually similar to what we do together as evaluators. So, to mark the Battles We Pick being 10 episodes old, today we're going to delve into some of the most interesting points made by other advocates and organizers who were featured in the first podcast episodes. Welcome, Kathleen, and thanks so much for doing this.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me, David. This is going to be fun, and congratulations on 10 episodes. That's awesome.
Well, thanks. Maybe we'll do this again after the second 10. So the way this is going to work is that I've clipped out a set of snippets from the podcast, and I have them all queued up for us to listen and react. The first is my friend and former colleague, Angela Bruce Rayburn. After George Floyd's murder, Angela began sparking conversations about racism in the international development field, a discussion she's continued in the years since and built into a DEI consulting practice. Let's hear what Angela said.
The fact that it was even allowed to be the topic of conversation in the halls of power, that even the UN talking about Black Lives Matter, okay, even hearing international organizations, big ones, USAID, global organizations, global NGOs, Oxfam, Save the Children, organizations who for decades to even talk about race would have been frowned upon. People would have not been open to conversations around race simply because our sector is so self-absorbed, right? We are saving people. So don't talk about racism. We are saving people, right? But now there was even an opportunity to speak about it. Now we're having panel discussions in these organizations. Shocking for someone like me who 10 years ago would have never been able to be so vocal or so open about what I was seeing. So that was the moment when I saw panel discussions being convened in all these international organizations, including the UN, willing to speak about systemic racism. That's when I realized, okay, these people are interested all of a sudden.
So I picked that clip because I think it says, or Angela is saying really interesting things about the space for discussion and how uh, new new debates and discourses start because new things are sort of ruled into uh, being open for discussion.
There are these windows that open for reasons that are completely unpredictable. And when I was listening to Angela, and she's got such a powerful presence there, I was thinking about the Louis Pasteur quote that chance favors the prepared mind, right? That it's decades and decades of people like her and people in the movements that she travels with being prepared for the opportunity for the bureaucracies that she works with to to be prepared to listen to this.
I think I think what an advocate is keenly aware of and all too familiar with is sort of the bounds on the subjects of conversation, and what um, what's been opened for debate, what's on the table, and what isn't ready to be discussed in terms of um, people's willingness to engage on it. Because I think a lot of issues um, sort of are waiting for that as a precondition to getting traction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that probably does. I was thinking something kind of analogous to that, which is that you have the Overton window that opens, but how long does it? Well, first of all, how wide is it? And second of all, how long does it last for, right? I mean, slightly different context than what Angela is talking about, but certainly in a lot of the United States, to the extent that there was a racial equity opening, it certainly seems like that door. Yeah, well, I don't know. Is it shutting? Is it, swinging back and forth? Hard to know, but really very unpredictable. And I think also with respect to the fora that Angela is working in, I do wonder how deep and pervasive within those bureaucracies is the change that advocates and activists are looking to make. You really hope that this is a generational shift, if you will, and that it goes without saying into the future that these intergovernmental or international organizations that she's working with have really made the shift to race as being a principal issue of concern. I guess it will require a few years or decades to figure out whether that's in fact the case.
If something um, comes within bounds to talk about, is that a genie out of the bottle? Um, you know, is is that discussion open permanently, or does it close, um, or is it not that it closes altogether, but that other question of, okay, the topics are on the table, the problem is being looked at in a new way, but that then leads to the question of what you're going to do about it. And so, is it a matter of, um, when it breaks open, that's a moment when you can do more, and the longer it takes to take advantage of that, maybe you can get less.
Well, I think that there's a lot of pieces to this, which unfortunately we're not going to be able to cover in an hour. I mean, one of the things is obviously the dedication of management to be to be serious about not only undertaking the conversation when it's an emergency situation in the rest of society, but to truly be signaling that this is a serious topic that that is going to be used to be measuring progress throughout the organization, into the future. And just thinking about again the field that we share, evaluation, when Michael Quinn Patton, who's a real thought leader in developmental evaluation, talks about the fact that what gets measured gets done. I mean, this is really where Angela and colleagues in the field are. That's where the rubber meets the road, right? I mean, can people identify really concrete measures that they are going to be working towards, so that in 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, there's a path of accomplishment that then, hopefully becomes inevitable.
Right. And as Angela works on the issue of race in the international development field, it's sort of a two-level effort, isn't it? Right. The proximate context is those organizations. They're being challenged to look at how they work, which then connects with how the work of development is done on the ground and whose voices are shaping that work.
Right, and that was the what I was saying a minute ago about horizontality. I mean, this it has to be an all organization engagement, and that management on all levels has to signal that they're serious about it over time.
Well, let's use that as a segue to a clip from Adete Akwe of Amnesty International. And the segue is that Adete has had a long career within a single organization and has been on sort of both sides of Amnesty's work in terms of being that, for a time, that inside game advocate in Washington, but for other parts of his tenure with Amnesty, has been more on the movement building, connecting with Amnesty's members and constituents. So let's hear what Adete has to say about those two modes of work.
You speak to an audience, and you have to speak in the language that the audience hears. And so that kind of experience with the U.S. government takes, I think, takes years, or it takes time, and it takes exposure. The audience on the other side, though, of movement building is about idealism. It's about achieving change. It's about showing up and connecting, and about linking the well-being and security and dignity of others that you're never going to meet with your own, and yours with theirs, and that linkage then allows it establishes a baseline of acceptable behavior for them as well as for yourself. And I think that has been one of the things that has kind of driven me into this area of more movement building and of organizing. In other words, how do you not only build a quote unquote political machine, a movement that can put pressure when pointed in the right direction, but how do you build a movement that has a certain that takes on an awareness of why it's important to show up, why is it important to support, why is it important to engage in politics, and of course to reject, the worst behaviors and policies. And I think that this is where late in my career, I feel that this is an equally important part of this is an incredibly important battle, because um, we now know governments are fickle. They can look at policy that was the rule 10 years ago by a different administration and say no. They can go back on agreements. They can go back even to unsign their signatures on international conventions.
A clip to sort of put into conversation with what Adite was just saying, and to get Gawain Kripke's perspective. And Gawain talks about, sort of from the other end, the uniqueness of the decision maker, the political decision maker, their perspective, and what you can get from that, and why that's important, at least in terms of some of the short-term incremental changes that are achievable. So let's hear what Gawain had to say.
There's a huge apparatus of policy analysis and think tanks and position papers and advocacy organizations and membership organizations, all of which has a kind of tentative connection to the electoral process. That's structurally required. Nonprofits can't engage in electoral activities. They have to keep these bright lines between them. And yet, when you're looking at the incentives and needs of elected officials, a lot of times there's a real mismatch and a disconnect between what advocacy organizations, especially sort of on the nonprofit or progressive side, are seeking and what the calculus is for elected officials. And I think trying to integrate those analyses a bit closer is an important thing to try to do. And when a political leader says, I want to do this, they're either making some kind of personal stand or an electoral calculus that's important to listen to. And sometimes I feel like we don't listen to our leaders carefully enough.
So there's a challenge to integrate the two perspectives in terms of that, taking those cues from people who in a way kind of make a living having a sense of what's achievable, but that's on the sort of less ambitious side. And then how do we integrate that with Adite's perspective about rooting the work in the perspectives and ideals and ambitions of a base of supporters and activists?
Yeah, this is a really interesting set of interviews. I enjoyed the compare and contrast between them, and I was thinking about the evaluation that you and I did a couple of years ago for a major philanthropic foundation that had the foresight and capacity to be bringing organizers from affected communities to Washington, to the seats of power, to the rooms where it happens, if they were not already there. And the transformational nature of having the base not only, left out in the cold, maybe in the long run designing the asks, but not at the table, contrasting that with the base people who are directly affected by the policies actually being at the table. And the client that we were working working for at the time on this evaluation put a stake in the ground and said this is what it's going to take in order for there to be policy change that is authentic to the impacted community. I think it was really the work that we did sort of showed this in a microcosm.
Are we saying that in the best case that there's hopefully a creative tension between the constraints of what's possible and the urgency and sort of firsthand experience of the challenges that that the creative tension and the best way to set your course is to sort of be looking at both simultaneously? Is that the point?
Well, I think it's a question of who is in service to whom, right? That there are, and you and I both worked in DC. I certainly would not say that I have any kind of grassroots organizing, mobilizing background, although I've certainly been involved in evaluations of movements with very strong grassroots orientation. There is a question of, I think, avoiding a situation in which the advocacy agenda is identified entirely within DC or Austin or Sacramento or name your capital, and the organizers, mobilizers, the base is supposed to fall into line. To the extent that that was ever a good idea, it certainly isn't now. But I also should sort of step out of this and say, interestingly enough, both of us were at the American Evaluation Association annual meeting last week, and I was having a drink with our wonderful podcast host friend Ann Price when David Fetterman came through the lobby, and we were talking with him. And David Fetterman is one of the originators of empowerment evaluation, which really stood evaluation a number of decades ago on its head. The idea that evaluators are disinterested observers, I think, in most quarters now is at least within advocacy policy change arena is somewhat or mostly discredited. So when folks like you and I, who are not, at least I'm not a policy actor, is opining about what the policy actors should be doing, I am thinking that I'm sort of teetering on that particular edge. What's my role in this? But I would say, if we are putting a stake in the ground, I would come down on the side of directly impacted communities should be at the table.
I was going to mention that we had just been at American Evaluation Association because I think I have a similar experience of those conferences, that those are presentations, discussions that give a good sense of emerging thinking and sort of how are things changing? What new awarenesses are there? What new correctives? And you're probably seeing some of the same things that I am, in terms of facing the fact, and you and I exemplify this. The profession of advocacy, the professionalization of it, has pulled things in that insider game direction, and you're right. We're hearing a lot about better connecting, better grounding in the perspectives of people who are affected the most. And so there's definitely a much stronger sense today of needing to step back and let those voices emerge in terms of where the focus should be, in terms of what what are the problems that should be tackled first. But in some of the same literature, I'm seeing that it doesn't go. The critique doesn't go so far as to like toss out the particular perspective that of professional advocates. Right? There's yeah. No, go
I think
ahead.
that's right. I mean, I think, well, there's hopefully there's some things that professional advocates, quote unquote, bring to the table that certainly should be widely shared. One of them is just the relationships, and I was thinking about in that context, thinking about your interview with Bob Walsh, our mutual friend and an important political player in Rhode Island over a number of decades with the teachers union, and now in various different civic affairs. I mean, the brilliance of Bob Walsh is that he knows the players, he knows the levers, and he also, is a brilliant strategist and is fast on the uptake when it comes to new substance. And you do need all of that, right? I mean, there has to be, when you're going to the State House in Providence, you need somebody who knows those people and also has that technical capacity. I think really what I'm thinking and saying here is that although that expertise is essential in a fast moving policy arena, and both of us have been in situations where there's a huddle of staff and advocates in the outside a committee room, writing amendments as a markup is happening. I mean, we know that is reality, and you have to have a certain set of background and skills to be able to do that and to be able to deliver that for your constituency. Those are skills. It's not rocket science. Those are the sorts of skills that I believe more people should have, and that this arena should be helping more people get those skills, so that the tent on the progressive side for doing that direct advocacy is broader.
Is there an engagement that you get via knowing the ins and outs of sort of their realm, right? Their area of responsibility, and how rules and regulations work, or how what the levers are through one part of government versus another, one area, one issue area versus another.
Yeah, obviously. I mean, expertise counts, right? I mean, if in fact you are going into an advocacy arena and it has to do with appropriations, for example, you need to have somebody who's on your side of the table who has a rock solid understanding of that exceptionally arcane area of policy making. No doubt. I don't think really that anybody is suggesting that what is needed for increased legitimacy is less of that sort of professional expertise. The real question is who gets access to build that expertise. And that really is, as you were saying, those of us who have white privilege, who have educational privilege, it's really on us, to the extent that we have influence, to make sure that that access to building that expertise is the broadest possible.
But I'm trying to make a point about openness as well as closedness, right? So, sure, some policy areas are all the more technical, demand a higher, pose a higher barrier to entry, demand a higher price of entry. But I'm asking whether sometimes becoming an expert is a more doable learning curve, right? And how beyond those equity challenges of seats at the table, that a little familiarity goes a long way in terms of scoping out the possibilities and sort of smoking out the players.
Yeah, I think the older I get, the more I think that a little humility and mutual respect is really is sort of a principal tool, certainly in collaboration, right? So every expert who is at the table, whether that is an expert in the arcane rules of appropriations, or whether that is the expert in the lived experience of people whose families have been separated by immigration detention. I mean, all of those people have expertise, and in an ideal world, we would have a situation where people who are working together in that collaboration have the trust and understanding of one another that they recognize that everybody at the table is going to have their back insofar as possible. I think that's really it. I think that in order to be both inclusive and effective, there's a huge trust building, there's a expertise building element, but a huge trust building element at the same time. And effective coalitions, collaborations have that.
Yeah, and I guess I just want to say that there's expertise and there's expertise, and that on that learning curve, that there are plenty of things that can be learned in a period of months or a year or so, right? That yes, there are deep expertises and technical complexities that do take years to build up, but some of these challenges of just getting familiar with what an agency does or a part of an agency does are not rocket science, I guess, maybe is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I mean, if we can do it.
Yeah. So bringing us to the last pair of voices, which again, I think are a good complement to each other. And they have to do with this issue of the relationship between the visionary, ambitious goals on the one hand, and the achievable nearer term incremental steps of progress on the other. And we're going to hear from Richard Healy, who actually was the most recent episode. He published a really interesting article on the Stanford Social Innovation Review about the lessons that can be learned from military strategy and how they are applicable to this work of advocacy and organizing, particularly the idea of the difference between winning the war and winning the battle. Let's hear from Richard.
Of what is winning? I'd say a couple things. Winning for community organizers, for the organizing community, it's very clear what a win is. You have a campaign and you set out winnable goals. They have to be 1 or 2 years out. I'm generalizing only a little bit. Legislatively, you either pass the bill or you don't. It gets signed or it doesn't. You may not worry about enforcement, but you know what a win is. And the reports, the year-end reports of our organizations, of our think tanks, our advocacy groups and foundations, they're filled with the thousands of wins that we have had. And I don't mean to mock that, but I want to be very careful about it, because yes, we work on winnable things and we win a lot of them, but they are battles. I use that word in the very precise sense that they are immediate, localized, that sometimes they're large battles like the ACA. That was a titanic battle and we won it under modified conditions. But again, one of the most useful parts of military thinking is the difference between the war and the battle. And a military truism is that you can win all the battles but lose the war. And this is, I think, one of the most core questions, I think, facing progressives is understanding the difference between the battle and the war, which would require us naming the war. Again, it goes back to this large-scale picture of who are we fighting and what we hope to do. So
that was Richard, and we've paired that with Elisa Massimino. She's a deeply experienced advocate on human rights issues. And Elisa talks about keeping the eye on the war or the ultimate aim as a sort of a guidepost for the work and any compromises that are needed. Here's Elisa.
I think having really clear what the vision is of where you want to end up is essential to give you the confidence that as an advocate that you can make compromises, that you can kind of get your hands dirty and talk to people, to try to move things in the right direction. Because if you don't have a really clear vision of where you're headed, I use all these sports analogies. I don't even know why, because I don't know that much about sports, but I'm a very visual person. Maybe that's why. And I think a lot about, like, if you don't know where the goalposts are, then compromising and incrementalism is fraught with peril, because you can run off course, pretty.
So those are a couple of very wise perspectives, steeped in a lot of experience and interesting ideas. What do you think?
Yeah, I had all sorts of thought leaders in my brain as I was listening to those. It turns out that Elisa, the work that Elisa has done as an advocate is adjacent to the work that I've done. So I know her field better than the fields of the other folks that we've been discussing so far in this hour. And she does make the important point that incrementalism is fraught with peril unless you know what the goalposts are. And I think about the decisions that can be made in the context of some policies. Just, immigrant rights is one that I think that she was talking with you about, and it's, again, the one that I know the best. There are some decisions that you make that are politically irrevocable. Irrevocable probably for a next generation or more. And it's very, very important to know what those are, and to be able to, try to fall on your sword when those things come up, if you can do that whatsoever. We've talked in the last year or so about a couple of experts in the measurement learning evaluation field, Liz Rudy from Democracy Fund and Sarah Stakoyak and her colleagues at ORS Impact, who have written very persuasively on defensive advocacy. And as I was listening to Elisa, I was thinking this is really very much she's really talking about the lessening the blow or the palliative impact of defensive advocacy work. It's possible to have palliative impact, but really important to be exceptionally clear on the goals as well as the details of the policy, so that as you're maneuvering the palliative, you are not making a bad situation worse.
The couple of interesting things came up in other parts of that conversation with Elisa. She and I talked about slicing out parts of an issue where that choice to narrow in on a piece of it kind of has this hazard of, well, does that mean that the rest of it is okay? If you work on eliminating the death penalty, capital punishment for minors, does that mean that capital punishment for adults is okay? I think there was a little bit of these kinds of dilemmas on, as you know, Lisa worked a great deal on issues of torture of detainees, and in the course of that work, ended up focusing on the U.S. Army's interrogation manual, and that left out a vulnerability to, well, how confident are we that that those rules were going to be held to, we're going to actually work as intended. And it was interesting to talk to Elisa, because that you're taking a chance, but she and I talked about this chance of, well, does that, if you are only take that on, are you kind of shutting off, are you setting the limit of what you're going to get? And her experience was interesting, because that's not how it played out. And what she found was that the ultimate effect, so yes, that was the risk, but as it turns out, it sort of hit refresh on a really stale debate.
Mm-hmm.
That, issues that had gotten stuck, that it was, it ended up generally unsticking things.
Oh,
Right.
That's interesting.
Right. Yeah. Rather than reinforcing the stuckness, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, this is really where complexity comes in a very big way. That's actually the other place in which my advocacy life intersected with Elisa's, is that I spent a couple of years at Physicians for Human Rights, supporting Nathaniel Raymond and John Bradshaw and a number of other. Scott Allen, a number of other advocates on the Army Field Manual, but also on supporting psychologists within our constituency to be getting the modifications out of the policy of the American Psychological Association that would forbid psychologists to be participating in national security torture. And because there was, I think there was in that situation the overlap of advocates both inside the military, inside the military health services, as well as outside, made for a particularly sort of interesting set of opportunities, right? I mean, the quantity of contacts and arenas in which that advocacy community writ large could credibly play was a great deal larger than other campaigns that I've been involved in. So I think that is, that's a really interesting example. I'm sure that Elisa and other experts, people much more expert than I am, will be writing on that in future years.
And as I say, Elisa's coming at it from one perspective, and Richard Healy from another. Right? So Elisa is concerned about avoiding making the wrong kinds of compromises, which is a certain danger. Richard's talking about more generally the need to keep the eye on the ball of the larger war and to have a really good understanding, not just of your principles or your ultimate aims, but the war that you're fighting, that bigger picture of your theory of change writ large, and having clear context, clear connections between the wider war and the narrower battles.
Yeah, I think you're raising the question of theory of change is really interesting here, and I think actually it's, as it often is, it's really fundamental, because when I was listening to Richard, I was thinking about some other thought leaders in the measurement learning, advocacy policy change world, Gigi Barsom and Julia Kaufman, in their work on advocacy that builds power. And the concept that you can be involved in an advocacy campaign or an advocacy arena with the express interest and intention of building power, so that the wins and losses are, while helpful, are in service to the building of the power in the community for to be able to take on additional goals in the future. I guess what I see where Richard is. I see where Richard is coming from, and he's obviously very, very deeply steeped in organizing, which again I'm not, but there is, I think, a slightly contrary argument that being engaged in these various small wins is potentially builds your power to be able to engage in campaigns or initiatives that eventually will get you the sort of more than a battle, or achieve maybe the big battle.
One of the critiques that I noticed at the American Evaluation Association meeting was a funder and an organization that is rethinking those power relationships and power disparities, and it's led them to to stop even using the rubric of capacity building. They had reached the conclusion that that the capacity building framework was very top down or donor driven. And they were trying to get away from that. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I think I don't want to make this conversation one long infomercial for the work that we do when you are not being a podcast host, but it does definitely argue for the fact that that a lot of work that is done in the political sphere, in the nonprofit sphere, I'm thinking about that presentation that you were just alluding to, which is more of a international development sphere, is not regularly examined. And I think this is something that both of us have noticed over the years of doing measurement and learning in this arena, is that there is a habit of very sophisticated organizations putting a lot of time and energy into doing a strategic plan, and then the plan, sits on somebody's wall or it sits on a shelf, and then 3 years or 5 years later, people come back and they relook at the plan. And in the interim, they are measuring things because their funders are requiring it, or their trustees or their boards are requiring it. But how much are they actively engaging in those strategic questions? I mean, that's a really important, deciding that you are going to pull back on viewing your work as capacity building and determining on the basis of your conversations with implementers on the ground and with the directly affected populations that there is a better way of looking at it. That's a very, very important insight. And I would argue that if you're really working your theory of change, if you are not merely putting your strategic plan on the shelf and coming back to it in 3 years, but that you are engaging your colleagues, and particularly the people implementing your strategy, in evaluative thinking, 3-4 times a year, then those sorts of insights are going to come up. There'll be an operational structure and also a permission structure for people to be thinking strategically about the assumptions and operations that are settled, and developing them over the time. And speaking of Richard and his military example, I think that's a huge thing that we can take from the military and from implementers for whom, frankly, making those sorts of changes is life and death.
Well, the group that was the focus of that discussion and that sort of reconceiving was American Jewish World Service and their human rights promotion work around the world in specific countries. And what they talked about was, and they used the term accompaniment, which you and I talked about, which for them is all about cueing in deeply to the work of their partners and getting familiar over time with their context and sort of being on the journey along with them, rather than and trying to get away from any sort of top-down directing. But right, the full name of our field, of course, is monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And it is all about learning, lifelong learning organizations. Speaking personally, I've learned a tremendous amount from you, my friend and colleague, over these last 6 or 7 years, and know that the podcast audience will get a lot from what you shared here today as well. So thank you again for coming on and sharing, and I do hope that we will do it again.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much, David. This was great fun. And again, congratulations on the first 10 episodes. And I'm looking forward to the next 10.